If you're a Goonie fan, you've no doubt heard of the infamous pirate and adventure legend One-Eyed Willie. But have you ever heard of One-Eyed Wiley? No? Okay. Who's your favorite explorer? Magellan? Vasco da Gama? Maybe Marco Polo or Dr. Livingstone? And your favorite pilot? Do you know any famous pilots? Most people don't realize what it took to be a pilot in the early days of aviation. If you don't have a favorite pilot, allow me to make a humble suggestion. In my opinion, the man I'm going to tell you about today should be mentioned among the most daring and visionary adventurers of all time. In fact, in just a few minutes, I bet you'll be wondering why you haven't heard of him already. After all, he was the first person to fly solo around the planet, the first to fly into the stratosphere, he was an early pioneer of parachutes, and even helped develop the first pressurized suit. You're welcome, every astronaut who's ever gone to space. At the time of his tragic death, he was one of the most popular men on the planet, and the man who died with him was also a historical icon. When these men perished, the world mourned. His adventurous exploits pushed aviation and innovation to new heights, far beyond the imagination and perhaps the burning ember of what if that led us to the moon. This is the story of Wiley Post, a man who came from absolutely nothing to go where no man has gone before, and he did it all with one eye. Wiley Post was born on November 22, 1898, where he experienced a challenging upbringing plagued by poverty. His family struggled to make ends meet, moving frequently in search of better opportunities, but typically finding only more struggles. In 1921, he was arrested for stealing a car, a crime likely driven by his desperate circumstances. He tricked some motorists into stopping their car and tried to rob them at gunpoint. Apparently, he had pulled over a hunting party that was armed to the teeth, so the robbery failed and Wiley went to prison. While in prison, he began to show signs of severe mental decline. Apparently in those days, rehabilitation was a priority of sorts. He was called back before the judge and given a stern talking to, something along the lines of, stop hanging out with a bunch of jerk faces and do something with your life. And boy oh boy, did he ever. 3 short years later, in 1924, Wiley Post's aviation career took a pivotal turn while at a barnstorming show in Oklahoma. In the early days of aviation, most people had never seen an airplane, so pilots took advantage of the sheer spectacle of flying by landing in farmland near barns, drawing a crowd and putting on exciting shows of skill and daring. On this particular day, the troop's regular skydiver was injured. Wiley Post, despite having no experience, convinced the owner to let him fill in. What? Remember, if it's the early days of aviation, it's certainly the early days of skydiving. Over the next 2 years, he continued to perform with the barnstorming troop as a wing walker and skydiver, making 99 jumps while honing his skills as a pilot, mechanic, and thrill seeker. After the burst of the barnstorming bubble, Wiley found himself working in oil fields. It was during this period that a tragic accident led to the loss of his left eye. What would you do if you just received a modest settlement and now have monocular vision rendering your depth perception completely useless? Right, you buy an airplane, of course. Wiley worked hard to prove that he could fly safely, and he earned his pilot's license. So, with his shiny new Curtiss Canuck, he began teaching student pilots, and more significantly, flying wealthy oilmen to their money-pumping rigs across Texas and Oklahoma. It wasn't long before Wiley Post caught the attention of oil baron F.C. Hall, who was impressed with Post's skill and his determination, and he hired Wiley as his personal pilot. Now, during this time, Post flew Hall around to various oil fields in Hall's own personal plane, a Lockheed Vega known as the Winnie Mae, a plane named after the oil baron's daughter that Wiley would soon turn into, arguably, the GOAT of airplanes. Wiley Post used the Winnie Mae to compete in various airplane races and set significant records in the early days of flight and gained well-deserved attention as a pilot and an innovator. He was pushing the limits of what could be accomplished with these new flying machines, and the public, as well as the aviation industry, were glued to what Wiley was doing. One of his notable achievements was winning the 1930 National Air Race Derby from Los Angeles to Chicago. He completed the race in 9 hours, 9 minutes, and 4 seconds. Needless to say, Wiley was making a name for himself. You've likely heard of a bloke named Charles Lindbergh. Yes, he flew solo across the Atlantic in 1927 and instantly gained worldwide fame while showing the public the possibilities of air travel. Before long, the aviation world, still just taking those awkward baby steps, was abuzz about flying around the globe. 4 years later, in 1931, Post and his navigator, Harold Gatty, set out to fly the Winnie Mae around the planet. the New York Times purchased the rights to Wiley's attempt and placed reporters ahead of the route. People turned into their radios and bought newspapers daily to follow this remarkable adventure. Post and Getty completed their globetrot in 8 days, 15 hours, and 51 minutes, setting a new world record by almost 2 weeks. A ticker tape parade and worldwide admiration quickly followed. Okay, now I know what you're thinking, but Lindy did it solo. Well, Wiley sees your solo flight and raises you another world record. 2 years later, in 1933, Post took to the wild blue yonder once again, solo, relying on a newfangled device called autopilot to help him with navigation. At one point, Wiley's carburetor froze and the Winnie Mae fell from the sky, only restarting just above the surface of the ocean. On another leg, Wiley was shrouded in fog and knew he was flying below the height of a nearby mountain. He said he would have jumped if he'd had a parachute with him. The fascination with Wiley's airborne adventures was as strong as ever, and 50,000 fans greeted him at his stop in Berlin. Despite the challenges, Wiley broke his own record by nearly 24 hours. The next day, another ticker tape parade took place in New York, and Wiley's legacy as an adventurer was secure. At the time, no individual had ever had 2 ticker tape parades in their honor, and Wiley's parades were bigger than the Yankees and even the astronauts a few decades later. People were obsessed with what this pioneering thrill seeker was doing. The physical demands and endurance required for this feat are simply astounding. When you imagine flying around the planet, you probably picture a globe, but try to actually give this feat some context. Try to imagine the vast, featureless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, only to be followed by the urban sprawl and the confusion of Europe and the almost never-ending monotony and extreme cold of Siberia, stopping in remote places with no proper runway and no one that even speaks your language, trying to source a new propeller because yours broke, having inaccurate maps because the Soviets didn't trust you, and constant fatigue lulling you to sleep. Yes, it was a monumental undertaking. I should mention that Wiley Post was not the first person to fly around the world. The first successful circumnavigation by air was accomplished by a team of U.S. Army Air Service aviators, 8 pilots and 4 planes flying from April to September in 1924. The flight involved a relay of Douglas World Cruiser aircraft and took 175 days, covering over 26,000 miles. There was also a Graf Zeppelin in 1929 that made the trip in roughly 3 weeks, the record until Wiley came along. Despite virtually no training, Wiley was more than just a man ready for an impossible challenge. He was also a serious innovator who acted more like an engineer than a mechanic. Before Wiley, any pilot attempting to fly into the stratosphere, which starts around 50,000 feet, would black out due to low atmospheric pressure and extremely low temperatures. Phillips Petroleum looked to Wiley to help solve this dilemma. To help address these challenges, Post collaborated with Russell S. Coley, an engineer, to develop the first practical pressurized flight suit, as well as the earliest implementations of breathing liquid oxygen and using the heat of the engine to avoid freezing to death. In 1934, Wiley donned this awkward, deep-sea looking precursor to a spacesuit and dove the Winnie Mae 50,000 feet up into the stratosphere. The flight was successful and provided valuable data that helped advance our understanding of the upper atmosphere. But that's not all. Post inadvertently made another important aviation discovery on the same flight. When he took off in the pressurized suit, the plan was to fly in circles, going up as he climbed and then returning to the same airport, descending in the same circular pattern. However, he ended up 80 miles east. Why? Post had discovered the jet stream, powerful winds that exist at higher altitudes that we now use for much faster flight and fuel efficiency today. To say that Wiley now had fans was an understatement. One of his biggest fans just happened to be another historical icon, the legendary comedian and satirist Will Rogers. Many people think Will Rogers was born in Oklahoma. He was not. He was born in 1879 in Indian Territory that later became Oklahoma. Try to imagine how fast the world was changing at the time. Rogers was born in Indian Territory, Native American territory, and later becomes friends with a man who just flew around the planet by himself.
William Knifeman.
Rogers was famous for taking his material directly from the newspaper headlines of the day, so the incredible adventures of Wiley Post quickly made it into Rogers' performances. Rogers was known for his wit, wisdom, and folksy charm, as well as his keen observations on American society and politics. Here's a few of those folksy nuggets. Good judgment comes from experience, and a lot of that comes from bad judgment. Advertising is the art of convincing people to spend money they don't have for something they don't need. The more you observe politics, the more you have to admit that each party is worse than the other. Even if you are on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. Wiley Post first met Will Rogers in 1931 during a flight to Alaska. The two men quickly formed a bond, fueled by their shared experiences and their appreciation of aviation and their down-to-earth experiences. You'd be hard-pressed to find any two men on Earth during this time whose combined fame and notoriety was greater than Post and Rogers. In August of 1935, the two friends went on a hunting expedition in the territory of Alaska. The now legendary and overachieving Winnie Mae had been purchased and eventually moved to the National Air and Space Museum. Replacing Wiley's reliable ride was a plane that soon became known as Wiley's Orphan, a cumbersome and less agile plane that was an assemblage of other wrecked planes and laden with questionable modifications. Wiley's Orphan was the kinder name, as Wiley's Bastard was another common term used by skeptical mechanics that had worked on it. Many were doubtful of this aerial oddity's reliability. To make the contraption even more questionable, Wiley added pontoons to the plane so that they could take off and land from the many lakes and rivers in Alaska, an extremely common way to travel even today. On August 15th, the two men were taking off from a lagoon near Point Barrow in poor weather conditions when the plane stalled. The heavy beast was thought to be about 200 feet above the surface of the water. There was no time to restart the engine and, due to the weight of the pontoons, the plane couldn't glide and it nosedived into 3 feet of water, killing both men instantly. The world mourned the death of these two American giants. When Charles Lindbergh heard of the tragic news, he flew to Alaska to retrieve the body.